Okay, we are on our final set of notes for Unit 7 and about to be done with air pollution. So, we're going to talk about noise pollution. And if you're wondering, that's not chemicals going into the air. What does that have to do with anything? Well, noise pollution is excess sound, and sound travels through the air. So, it's technically grouped with air pollution. So, let's talk about it. So, before we can go into what counts as noise pollution, we need to try and figure out how is noise measured. It's measured on the decibel scale. So here we see an example of various sounds and their decibel rating. It measures the intensity of the sound. So as you go higher, the intensity is greater, and that's more likely to be considered noise pollution. So for example, someone whispering or leaves rustling, that's going to be a decibel of that's going to be a decibel intensity of about 30 decibels. Average rooms are going to have noises ranging from 30 to 50 decibels. But once you get above 70 decibels, if you have prolonged exposure to that, that can start causing damage or negative health impacts. So, for example, if you're inside and you, like me, hear a neighbor mowing their lawn or doing yard work, that's about 75 decibels. If you are, let's see, listening to a hand dryer like in the bathroom or a motorcycle passing, that's going to be about 100 decibels. Really loud places like a nightclub or bar, which none of you should know the sound of, that's going to be 105 to 110 decibels. A jet engine, so if you live near any airport, that's going to be 135 decibels. And if you're close to a gunshot, that will be 140 decibels. So those higher end noises are ones that you're going to want to stay away from because they can cause physical damage as well as other damage. So, what is noise pollution? It's categorized as any sound that's coming at levels high enough to cause either stress, physiological stress, so some sort of physical stress, or hearing loss. Now, the EPA has a definition for what counts as um, environmental noise, and that's if over a 24-hour period of time you're exposed to an average level of noise, of sound, of intensity 7 decibels or more. Now, having short but very much louder incidences of sound can cause damage and can be considered noise pollution. So for example, the on the previous slide we looked at how a gunshot was the highest sound intensity on that scale. That's why when people go to gun ranges, for example, for target practice, they wear ear protectors to make sure that they're not getting damage to their ears. So where does noise pollution come from? Here on this diagram we see a lot of the common sources of air pollution. So, airplanes, if you live near an airport, you're going to hear noise pollution. Amplified music. So, like for example, sometimes I have my door open and I can hear the neighbors partying with really loud music. And if it's of a high enough sound intensity, then that's going to be considered noise pollution. Emergency vehicles, when you hear police, ambulances, fire trucks passing by, that's a loud noise. Traffic can also be a source of noise. For example, when I was growing up, I lived about a mile away from I-35. And that's like just map distance, not how far it took to drive. And sometimes at night, when we had the windows open, I could hear the traffic on 35, even from a mile away. Construction or industrial activity, as well as landscaping equipment and things like that. So, transportation, construction, domestic activity, things you do in the house, or industrial activity, stuff that happens, in a factory or anything that's making noise is a source of noise pollution. So, what are some of the effects of noise pollution? Well, it causes stress in humans and animals. And as anyone who's experienced stress knows, stress can cause physical symptoms that can be have negative health impacts. So some of the things that can affect humans, there have been studies linking cardiovascular disease, hypertension, high stress levels, tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, hearing loss, and sleep disruption. All of that has been linked to excess noise. It can also negatively impact the health of both vertebrates and invertebrates. So there have been plenty of studies on, for example, like how noise pollution in the ocean affects vertebrates like whales. There have been some studies also looking at maybe the impacts on fish, but one of the newer avenues of study is, well, there are a lot of invertebrates, crabs, shrimp, lobsters, um, sea stars, coral, and what's a more interesting avenue of research right now is how does noise pollution affect those organisms? They form a large part of the marine community and food webs, and so negative health impacts on them are going to kind of accumulate and build up. Then there's a problem in that a lot of organisms, like we, use sound for communication. Sometimes they use it for hunting as well. So, a lot of organisms that are birds or insects will attract mates through making specific sounds. And I forgot to put on this list as well frogs, which anything that makes sound to communicate and attract mates is going to be vulnerable to noise pollution. So, birds, crickets, frogs, they're all going to have potentially decreased success in attracting mates, which means decreased reproduction for their population, or their behavior will change. So, for example, some birds near urban areas have changed their behavior to to make bird calls and try and attract mates only late at night when there's less traffic noise. Bats emit high-pitched sounds and listen for the echo of those in order to help them hunt. That's called echolocation. But if there's a lot of background noise, then they're not going to be able to hear effectively the sounds that are coming back to them. And also, hearing loss, they can get hearing loss because of noise pollution, which eliminates their ability to hunt. There are a lot of impacts in the ocean and marine communities. So, for example, a lot of mammals that live in the ocean, as well as fish, use sound to help them navigate. So, dolphins will also echolocate. They'll make those clicking noises and listen for the echo that comes back. They'll also use song to communicate. Whale song is very common example, as well as foraging. And so, if there's excess noise in their environment, that's going to disrupt those behaviors. And then, since some organisms use sound in order to help them with hunting, it can disrupt either the prey's ability to avoid predators, or it can disrupt predator's ability to find prey, which can then decrease survival, which would decrease populations of those organisms. And then some, like I said, organisms use sound especially for communication, and especially if they're using that to attract mates or for navigation, that's going to become a problem. Also, if there's a lot of background noise, then animals have to make themselves louder to be heard above that noise. Just like if you're in a noisy room, you have to shout. And if you're in a noisy room and you're trying to talk over it, most people, their throat starts to get sore. I mean, if you have to like talk with a higher volume for prolonged periods of time, you can actually damage your throat if you have to do that. And another problem is we put a lot of sound into the ocean. So, for example, sonar is kind of like the underwater equivalent of radar. It's how submarines and ships detect things. That is basically sending a sound pulse and detecting the echo. So it's like human echolocation. There's also sound waves emitted that are used to detect like objects on the floor of the ocean. That's what's happening in this picture. So this boat sends out sounds and it detects the echo. That can also be used in greater detail to try and find oil deposits because sound waves can travel through layers of rock. And if you look for changes in how that sound echoes back, then you can detect these kind of changes in the types of rock and make it more likely you can find out where oil deposits are. Then ships and their motors, as they're going through the water, will make noise, oil drilling, and there's some underwater explosions as well, which can then lead to either temporary or permanent loss of hearing for organisms. Another problem is that when you have these high areas of noise, especially urban areas, which are going to have more concentrated people, going to have lots of traffic sounds, those are very noisy areas. And so organisms that can't take that noise level can move or change habitats or even alter their migration routes. And that's bad because then they could end up, instead of being in a habitat that they're well adapted for, they could end up in a habitat they're less adapted for, and that can decrease their survival. So, this image is from an experiment that some scientists did where they were testing forest birds and grassland birds. So, they had some speakers out and they were testing the effect of noise at an ambient level. That's like the level just without anybody creating extra noise. So if you go out and sit in nature and you don't have any traffic, any people, animals making noise, just the background noise you hear, that's going to be ambient noise. And then a far away sound source and a nearby sound source. And then they measured what that did to the species abundance and the species richness. So notice for forest birds, for example, um, that if you look at these error bars and how they don't kind of overlap, there's a distance between them. That tells you that there is definitely a difference in the species abundance for ambient noises only versus near noises. There's a significant decrease in species abundance when you have noises nearby. Similarly, the species richness also decreases for forest birds, although notice it's not really impacted very much for grassland birds. And that can impact your local communities and, I mean, just all sorts of impacts. All right, that is the end of Unit 7. On to Unit 8.